Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are well, as always. Today, what we're going to do is review for the final exam. I've already sent you the final. As per the instructions that I sent you, please do email it to me when you're finished and also post it on Blackboard. There will be, as you know, 7 questions. Please answer all of the questions. Your answer should be approximately 1 page in length, that is typed and double space, please. So what we're going to do over the course of the next couple of weeks is, again, we will review today. Next week, I will send you out some films about various styles and artists in 20th century art as well. And then I would like to have your exams sent, please, by the latest May 6th. Certainly you can send them in to me before that as well if you'd like. But given the fact that it is an open book note, I'm going to ask more of you. Open book and open note exam, I'm going to ask more of you than I normally would. You may use anything that I have said. You may use anything from books. If you use what I have said, please do paraphrase it. If you use anything from a book or an article, please do put it in quotation marks and cite the source so as to avoid plagiarism. That's a very important thing to do. And again, in order for me to do the required attendance today, please do send me an email with your full name and the subject line and a number that I will provide you a little bit later on during the course of the lecture. So let's go. This is a work done by Rembrandt. The final exam will not be cumulative, that is, it will be from the point of the Dutch Baroque on. And by the way, this, what we're going to do today is essentially an overview. So it would really be much better if you go back to the original class sessions. There's much more material, obviously, in those than we can do during our time together today. And again, because it's an open book, open note exam, I will expect a little bit more from you. So again, this is pretty much of an overview, but let's talk about the Dutch Baroque first of all. And you may remember that there were 2 aspects about society in Holland during this point in time, that is the Baroque, which had a decisive impact on how art developed at that point in time. Number 1, it was a middle-class society as opposed to an aristocratic society. And number 2, they followed the teachings of John Calvin as opposed to Catholicism. When Holland gained its independence from Spain politically, they gained independence from their point of view from Catholicism. So they followed the teachings of Calvin. That was important for our purposes because Calvin stipulated that there should be no images in churches. And if you think about it, as we talked about the first time around, that obviously eliminated an entire system of patronage, that is the church. So the result of that is that artists at that point in time essentially worked in the same way that you do or will if you happen to be in fine arts or crafts as opposed to one of the design areas. That is, you appeal to the taste of the middle class. And in the Netherlands during this point in time, artists were expected to specialize in various different fields. They became the little Dutch masters, if you will, specializing in such areas as portraiture, landscape, still life, views of town, genre, that is, views of everyday life situations. Those are some of the areas in which artists would specialize. Rembrandt, of course, was the star of the Dutch Baroque, and you may recall that he did a number of portraits in his lifetime. And the first time around, we talked about the portraits within the context of events of his life. And I just want to show you again a couple of them today. This is a portrait that he did when he was about 22 years old. He's a very young man. He's showing himself as being very naive, not knowing what the future will hold for that matter as well. And you may recall that Rembrandt believed that people played various roles during their life and they wore various masks. So the mask, if you will, that he's wearing in this particular portrait is something of a counterculture figure. He certainly seems not to care at all about the impact that this portrait will have on the ever so respectable members of the middle class who eventually will become his patrons. That changes a little bit later on. You might recall that he married Saskia, who had come from a quite wealthy family, an influential family. And largely as a result of that marriage, he got a lot of commissions to do works of art. Eventually he made a lot of money, you might recall that. But he spent it quite profitably, you may recall from our earlier discussion. And this is another self-portrait that he did, self-portrait in old age. Sometimes it's called laughing self-portrait. And he died broke, you might recall that. After having spent a whole lot of money, he eventually, in fact, went bankrupt. This is Rembrandt's The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp. It is a group portrait. And I'll tell you right now, and you have the exam already, please be able to discuss the characteristics of group portraiture in the Netherlands. And then we'll talk about how Rembrandt's painting of the Night Watch was both innovative as well as controversial. You'll see that in a bit. But this piece, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp, is the piece that sort of catapulted him to fame and fortune. One of the reasons for its popularity was because dissection had been made legal at this point in time period, and many people were interested in it. But the two characteristics of group portraiture are the following. Number one, because it is a portrait, obviously the painter had to produce a reasonable facsimile of the features of the people in the portrait. Now, the first time around, we talked about whether or not indeed Rembrandt was successful in this, and you essentially decided that perhaps he was not. Maybe the only person with some semblance of individuality in his face is Tulp, who is the figure on the far right, the professor himself. The rest of them look very much similar to each other. Now, again, this is an early piece. He's still a very young man at the point in time that he did that. But again, the first characteristic of group portraiture is accuracy of the facial features of the people involved. The second thing that artists had to do in a group portrait is show them involved in some common activity. That is what it is that constitutes them as a group. So what you have here is a group of students and the professor whom Rembrandt has distributed in a semicircular fashion around the corpse. And we talked about the rather bizarre anatomy of the figure of the corpse for that matter as well. But folks, do check this particular piece, The Night Watch. As I said, I will ask you how Rembrandt's Night Watch was both innovative as well as controversial. This too is obviously a group portrait. Remember, if you would, that the Civic Guard, who you see here, was the militia organization, which was largely responsible for the Netherlands gaining its independence from Spain. So they were pretty important in a social way, and pardon me, they would very often gather at intervals, and more often than not, they would commission an artist to do a group portrait of them. Most of those group portraits are pretty staid affairs. I don't have the slides to show you today, but the first time around I showed you some images done by Frans Hals, another Dutch artist of the same subject matter, and it is not nearly as interesting as this particular compositional configuration of the same subject matter. But there are two ways by which this painting should be considered to be both innovative as well as controversial. One has to do with the point in time that he has selected to portray here. That is, it is the time that the Civic Guard has just received their marching orders. And the result of that is all the agitation that appears here. Now, it's innovative, but it's also controversial, was controversial, I should say, because the Civic Guard contended, and they probably were right about this, that because of this point in time, it was difficult to make out the individual faces of the people involved. So they objected quite strenuously to it. The other way that it was both innovative as well as controversial had to do with the way that Rembrandt deals with light and shade. And you might remember that in a general sense, what Rembrandt will use is, use light and shade to structure the compositional configuration, also to either reveal or conceal something about the nature of his subject matter. something that one writer refers to as the psychology of light. But if you take a look at this particular painting, he has again used light in order to pull the painting together. So the drum on the far right is well lit, as is the leader, one of the leaders of the Civic Guard, just to the right of center, as is that small figure, the female figure, to the left of the figure dressed in black, also the lances and some of the faces as well. So he has used it, in fact, to structure the compositional configuration. However, by the same token, from the point of view of members of the Civic Guard, many of their faces were in shadow. And so the use of light and shade, again, was not only innovative, but it was also considered to be controversial at the time period. And if you take a look very carefully in the background, you might be able to see an oval form that is a cartouche. And on the cartouche were written the names of all of the people whose faces appeared in this particular piece. Okay, so as I said, do check this particular one and keep it in mind in terms of how it was innovative and controversial. Also have an understanding about the various characteristics of group portraiture. Okay, let's go on to the Baroque in Spain. And you might recall that there were two artists whose names that I asked that you keep in mind. Number one, El Greco, and number two, Velázquez. And we talked about the fact that in some ways, Spain, which at this point in time was the most powerful country in the Western world, had two seemingly divergent characteristics to describe its culture. On the one hand, a very strong sense of an emphasis upon religious mysticism, and the work of El Greco obviously manifests that particular piece. On the other hand, the work of Velázquez emphasizes the strong sense of realism. And the first time around, and I'm doing it again today, I used realism in the sense of the way that we used it in reference to Caravaggio, that is showing life as it really is. If life is ugly, if people are cruel to each other, that must constitute your subject matter. But this is a pretty important piece by El Greco. It's entitled The Burial of Count Orgaz, and it represents a legend of a miraculous event that took place when the body of a very generous Count Orgaz, was to be laid to rest in the tomb, which had been provided for it. Two saints, St. Augustine and St. Stephen, came down from heaven and actually lowered his body into the tomb. Simultaneously, the presiding priest, who's over at the lower right, looked up to heaven and saw the soul of the Count being taken up to the heavenly realms. That's Jesus at the top in the judgment seat, Mary to his right, St. John, the most beloved of the apostles, to his left. Peter also to the right. We know that's Peter because he's holding the keys of the kingdom. The work of El Greco is characterized by a light which seems to be really very ethereal, that is otherworldly. It does not look naturalistic. It's really quite scintillating. Also, the figures are often elongated. There is an overwhelming power of mysticism in virtually all of his works. This is also the work of El Greco, and it is a portrait that he did of the cardinal who eventually became the head of the Spanish Inquisition. And let me remind you of the work of Velázquez, one of which you see here. And Velázquez represents the other side of Spanish painting, that is the emphasis upon realism. This particular piece is variously entitled The Drinkers or The Topers. It's very obvious that he's looking at Caravaggio here, tenebrism. The fact that the figures look to be real working people, you know, their hands are gnarled, their facial features are roughened. Also the fact that the figure to the left of center is in fact Bacchus, and this is pulled directly out of a painting of the same name done by Caravaggio, which you may recall, which in fact was a self-portrait done by Caravaggio. And finally, this particular piece by Velázquez, also Spanish Baroque in terms of style, and it's variously entitled, the Spanish name is Las Menenas, which translates variously as the ladies in waiting or the maids of honor. That is Velázquez at the far left at work on a painting. And you might recall the interpretation of this. That is, for many, many years, it had been thought that what he was painting was the little girl, the Princess Margarita of the Habsburg family and her various attendants. But upon really looking carefully at the painting, a number of scholars determined that obviously the subject matter that he is at work on is not Margarita and her attendants, but it is in fact the king and queen whose portrait he is painting. You see them in the background, their faces reflected in the mirror. Okay, and let's go on to Rubens as well. He was from the Flemish Baroque. You might remember this is a self-portrait with Rubens himself and Isabella Brandt, who became his first wife. He was very much of an aristocrat in many respects, without doubt the most important painter in Flanders. And Flanders, by the way, was equivalent to what is now basically modern-day Belgium. His primary subject matter eventually became the female nude. As you can see here, this is the Three Graces, and he paints them in a very, very sensuous fashion, as you can see. Okay, let's go on to the Rococo. And please understand the Rococo period as a culture as well as an art style. And the time frame we're in, by the way, is the 18th century. The first few decades of the 18th century. It was an international lifestyle as well as art style, but we remained exclusively in France because in many ways the French Rococo is the epitome of the Rococo style. But let me ask that you check this particular painting, The Embarkation from Cythera by Watteau, W-A-T-T-E-A-U. This is a very important work of art, and you should perhaps reference this particular piece in the question, which will deal with the Rococo period in the final exam. So let's talk about it as a culture, first of all. And again, let me remind you that this was an aristocratic, courtly culture. It was not a middle-class culture or art style for that matter as well. At this point, the aristocracy still reigned supreme. Now, obviously, that ends at the end of the 18th century. The French Revolution breaks out in 1789, as you may recall. But at this point, they're still in power. They were obligated to, pardon me, follow really absurd social rules. You might remember the film that I posted for you on Versailles, in which they had to bow to the king's food. They had to knock on a door with their little finger as opposed to their knuckle. It was really absurd, and it was absolutely obligatory that they spend a lot of time at Versailles. They were not in the least bit interested in sincerity, in the lives of the poor people. And the best statement that I know to describe the nature of Rococo culture was, in quotes, the Rococo had the manners of a dancing master and the morals of a whore. So you might want to consider that statement within the context of a consideration of the culture of the Rococo. In terms of the art style, excuse me, it beautifully reflected the lifestyle. This is an art of frivolity, of insincerity, of entertainment, of titillation. Again, they were not in the least bit concerned with such things as what was going on with the lives of common everyday people. They were only interested, as I said, in being entertained. So you should consider this particular painting within that context. And let's talk about it in terms of subject, theme, and formal elements. Again, it is entitled The Embarkation from Cythera. C-Y-T-H-E-R-A is the way that is spelled. Cythera was the magical island of Venus, the goddess of love. And according to legend, if you were fortunate enough to go on holiday to Cythera, the entire time that you were there, you would be handsome or beautiful, as the case may be, and you would be in love. But as portrayed in this particular painting, now, unfortunately, it's time for these aristocrats to leave. Venus, by the way, is represented at the far right with that sculpture garlanded with flowers. And as you can see, a lot of the people look pretty reluctant, but leave they must. And at the far left, you can see part of an ornately decorated ship, which is going to take them back to mundane, boring, everyday reality. They don't want to go. That's the subject. The theme is just quite simply fantasy. So let's take a look at such formal devices as color, composition, application of paint, space, etc. First of all, color. Secondary colors, pastel colors, nothing very jarring. These people are not interested in reality. They're not interested in anything jarring. Therefore, primary colors would be out, as you can see. The application of paint is very loose. That is, it is painterly, so it's almost as if you are looking at the scene through gauze, and by the same token, in terms of coloration, looking at it through rose-colored glasses. Space is defined in terms of a gradual approach to space, that is gradual recession, as opposed to distinct planes, with the exception of the plane of the figures. And the composition is essentially open. So please do check this particular painting if you would. Consider it within the context of the Rococo period. I also showed you the work of Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, one of whose self-portraits you see here. Vigée-Lebrun was essentially a portrait artist. She was quite prolific. That is, she produced many, many portraits during her lifetime, essentially over 800 of them. And this is the painter, you might recall, who was a friend of Marie Antoinette, who was supporting her family by the time that she was 15. This is one of over 30 portraits that Vigée-Lebrun did of Marie Antoinette. And this particular piece, which I think is one of her strongest works, we talked about it the first time around within the context of some statements that were made by a critic of the time period, whose name was McFall, who said that Vigée-Lebrun painted a woman as a woman completely lacking any depth of character. And it does seem as if, in fact, this woman is lacking depth of character. She doesn't look particularly bright. Yes, she's beautiful, seemingly perhaps fairly accomplished, but it doesn't look as if she's particularly intelligent. So at first blush, it would seem as if McFall was right in his assessment. But as I pointed out to you the first time around, we know that Vigée-Lebrun kept a diary. And in it, she referred to this particular woman as, in quote, completely lacking in wit, end quote, and said anytime that she is confronted with a sitter like that, she would show them, in quotes, heedlessly reclining and gazing upward, which is obviously precisely what she has done here. I show you this piece by Vigée-Lebrun to point out to you the fact that when there was some depth of character and intelligence, she was more than capable of producing that. Clearly here, this is a portrait of a Russian aristocrat. Okay, let's go on. And let me reintroduce you to neoclassicism. This is an important style. And do check this particular painting by Jacques-Louis David, which is entitled The Oath of the Horatii. I'll tell you right now, you should be able to compare and contrast neoclassicism and romanticism in terms of general subjects, themes, and formal elements. And you should also be able to reference specific works of art, such as this piece, David's Oath of the Horatii, and Delacroix's Death of Sardanapalus, within your answer. So let's talk in general about neoclassicism, which means, as you know, new classicism. The time frame we're in, the end of the 18th century, moving into the 19th century. The date on this, depending on who you happen to read, is either 1784 or 1785. Pardon me. The general attitude of neoclassicism was an intellectual one. That's important for you to keep in mind. These artists were pretty much big time into theories. The general subject matter had to do with classical history, by which I mean the history of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. The general thematic concerns had to do with Stoicism, that is self-sacrifice for some greater ideal. And in terms of formal elements, line was prominent. It was the most important expressive device. One of them said line is the high principle of all art. So obviously the application of paint in these works is very linear, as you can see in this particular piece. The compositional configuration is usually closed. Sometimes it is based on the triangle. That's clearly a reference to the Renaissance. Sometimes an almost mathematical ordering of the various elements, as you can see in this particular painting. That is the repetition of three groups of figures, three arches, etc. Space is defined in terms of very clearly delineated planes, as opposed to the gradual recession of, for example, the Rococo, or for that matter, what you will see a little bit later in Romanticism. Okay, let's talk about this particular piece. The Oath of the Horatii had to do with the history of ancient Rome. Rome was having a confrontation with a neighboring city-state, which was called Alba. And because they were both very strong, both nations realized that if they went to war, no one would really win, but it would just be general carnage. So each of them put up their three most powerful warriors. And the agreement was that those warriors would fight to the death. And if somebody survived, that person's nation would be victorious. So although two of the Horatii, whom you see at the left, were killed, one survived. All three of the Albans were killed. Therefore, Rome was victorious. And what David has done here is show these three warriors taking an oath on the swords being given to them by their father to win for Rome or die trying. Theme, again, self-sacrifice for some greater ideal. And you have to understand that this is only a couple of years before the outbreak of the French Revolution. And David himself was very much in support of the French Revolution. So the idea is that just as these warriors were willing to, and indeed too did, sacrifice themselves for the greater ideal of Rome, so the French people should be able to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the French Revolution. Again, please check this painting. It's a very important work of art. This is also by David. It's entitled The Battle of the Sabines. And the subject matter, again, is from the history of ancient Rome. The Sabine Republic was invaded by the Roman warriors because the Roman warriors wanted wives and they abducted Sabine women. Several years later, the Sabine men came to rescue them, but it was essentially too late. Children had been born. So the woman just to the left of center is trying to prevent the Roman warrior on the right and the Sabine warrior on the left from killing each other for the sake of the children. The theme is one of reconciliation. And this piece by David is entitled To Marat, as you can see down on the lower left, Marat. Marat was one of the French revolutionaries, as you know, one of the most radical of the French revolutionaries. And he was also a personal friend of Jacques-Louis David. He was murdered in his bathtub by Charlotte Godet. So what David has done here is turn what was really a quite ridiculous death for a revolutionary into essentially a martyrdom. So he has portrayed Marat in terms of the position that Michelangelo portrayed Jesus in his sculpture, the Pieta. Okay, let's go on to Romanticism, which in many respects is diametrically opposed to neoclassicism. Again, please be able to compare and contrast neoclassicism and Romanticism in terms of subject, themes, and formal elements. The primary Romantic artist that I ask that you keep in mind was Delacroix, whose work you see here. This is entitled The Bark of, or The Boat of Dante. But let's talk about Romanticism as a lifestyle, first of all, as well as an art style. And as I pointed out to you the first time around, the Romantic will say that, yes, perhaps he, she is confined by the three variables that Emile Zola, the realist writer, talked about, that is heredity, environment, and moment in time. But what gives a romantic person some sense of liberty is his or her ability to go anywhere in his imagination. So this art style and lifestyle is very much predicated on that, and emotion, as opposed to the intellectual tendencies of neoclassicism. We talked the first time around about some so-called romantic experiences, such as travel to supposedly exotic countries, unfortunately, such as drugs, for that matter as well. Being able to understand something intuitively as opposed to intellectually, falling in love, and preferably the love is unrequited, as absurd as that sounds, but then you will feel pain. You therefore know that you are alive. Okay, this is an early piece done by Delacroix. And whereas in terms of subject and theme, it is romantic, it is not yet in terms of formal elements. Excuse me, subject and theme. This has to do with the journey of the poet Dante to hell, with the Roman poet Virgil as his guide. So the French Romantics, as I pointed out to you the first time around, seem to have been obsessed with death and blood and horror, likely because they lived through the horror of the French Revolution. Formal elements, not so much romantic in this particular painting. It's quite conservative in many respects. Triangular compositional configuration, emphasis upon line as opposed to color. But that changes with this particular piece by Delacroix. And check this particular work, if you would please. Have some understanding about it in terms of subject, theme, and formal elements. This is Delacroix's Death of Sardanapalus, based on an English poem named by a poet named Lord Byron, of a poem of the same name, that is the Death of Sardanapalus. Sardanapalus is the figure reclining on the bed. He was a Middle Eastern king. His enemy had surrounded his city. He understood that he had lost, and he had resolved, in fact, to commit suicide. But before he took that one final step, he wanted to achieve one final emotional peak, and in a really quite perverse way, what Byron shows him doing in the poem and what Delacroix shows him doing in this painting is having his favorite wives and horses murdered in front of him. Now, it's obvious that nothing's really moving him. He looks bored. He's not feeling anything because he suffers from the romantic disease of ennui. That is, he has experienced so much that nothing moves him anymore. Okay, so that's the subject matter. Theme, blood, death, horror, typical French romantic theme. Formal elements, color stressed over line, painterly application of paint, gradual recession back into space, pardon me, and a compositional configuration which is open, and it is reliant, as you can see, on the diagonal movement here. So please do check this painting, folks. Have an understanding, if you would, please. And let's go on to a consideration of the style of realism and the work of Daumier. Daumier is the one and only realist artist that I'm going to ask that you consider. This is realism with a capital E and capital R, excuse me. And I'll tell you right now, do have an understanding of how subject and theme in Daumier's work relate to the style of realism. And this is a very important case in point. Even though this is realism with a capital R, and it is a 19th century style, you can see the date on this particular piece, that it was done in 1834, the Rue Transnonaine. The term should be used as we used it in reference to Caravaggio and Velázquez, that is, showing life as it really is. If life is ugly, so be it. In terms of Daumier's work, he had two major themes. On the one hand, specific political criticism, which is what you see here, got him in a lot of trouble with the very repressive King Louis Philippe, the so-called bourgeois, that is the middle-class king. So he therefore then turned his attention, after he was released from prison where he served a 6-month sentence, to his second major theme, which had to do with a gentle parody of the human condition. But you should have some understanding, please, about this particular piece. The Rue Transnonaine, April 15th, 1834, which is the date of a particular atrocity which happened. Louis Philippe had put into place a number of very repressive laws to ensure that his reign continue. And one of them was called the Law of Association, which forbade people from gathering in large groups. Why? Because you gather in large groups, you start talking about problems and perhaps pose some solutions, that is, overthrowing the king. And in order to ensure that this law and other repressive laws were followed as well, they sent battalions of troops into the poor sections of Paris. And at one point, a group of soldiers claimed that they had been fired on by snipers from a tenement. They marched in, they killed everybody without asking any questions. So that's what you see here. The subject matter I just described to you, the theme, obviously, horror, death, and essentially political oppression. This got him in trouble, quite a bit of trouble. We have a print in the DIA of this particular piece. Daumier worked primarily as a printmaker. He was also a painter as well. And what the government did is they confiscated the lithographic plate and stone, rather, I should say, and they destroyed it. So not as many prints were pulled as usual. While this got him in trouble, this is the piece that resulted in Daumier being sent to prison for 6 months. It's called Gargantua, and it is a savage indictment of the king himself. As you can see, the ramp going up into the king's mouth, he is consuming the foodstuffs that the people of France have worked very hard to produce. It was at that point in time, part of the language, that the French word for pear was slang for idiot. And as you can see, the head of Louis Philippe is in the shape of a pear. So off to prison he goes for 6 months. And when he gets out, he turns to the second of his major themes, that is a gentle parody of the human condition, including members of his own artist community. He's satirizing them here. The neoclassicist on the right, as opposed to the realist painter on the left. And an example of some of the paintings that Daumier did. This is an oil painting entitled The Print Collector. I think the idea behind here is that everybody's entitled to a little bit of beauty in his or her life. You know, clearly this is a man from what in American socioeconomic terms might be described as the lower middle class, going through a portfolio of prints. Even though he probably has a very difficult life, he too is entitled to some beauty in his life. Okay, let's go on to a review of Impressionism. Please have an understanding about the various concepts of Impressionism, as well as the formal elements, that is application of paint, space, composition, and color within that context. This is a painting by Claude Monet, M-O-N-E-T, who was without doubt the most important of the Impressionist painters, perhaps the only true Impressionist painter. Even Renoir, who is sometimes considered, along with Monet, as being one of the orthodox or the high Impressionist painters, eventually does leave Impressionism, reintroduces line. But let's talk about the concepts of Impressionism. And by the way, this is the painting that gave Impressionism its name. A critic looked at it and said, why, it's not really a seascape, it's only an impression of a seascape. So the suffix ism was applied to that term. And the word Impressionism was applied in derogation to the work of these artists, as you know. We're in France, and the decade of the Impressionist movement was the 1870s. This is, by the way, a form of naturalism. And what they were trying to do was show the object as it really appears in white light, okay? In terms of subject, very often a ostensible subject matter of an Impressionist painting is middle-class pleasures, in this particular case, a boating party. But the real subject matter of an Impressionist painting is light, and how light is reflected or plays over various objects, be they human beings or haystacks or cathedrals. If you happen to be Monet, it doesn't really matter. Theme, they do away with traditional theme, by which I mean something to do with the nature of the human condition. And there's one writer who describes the Impressionist theme as a fleeting glimpse of reality, that is showing an object as it appears in white light for a very short period of time. Formal elements. First of all, color. There were a number of scientists who were working during these time periods, and they discovered that, as we now know, white light is comprised of the 7 colors of the spectrum. So the Impressionists say that they will only paint with the various colors of the spectrum. Now, in point of fact, they regularly do violate that dictate. You'll see some black down at the lower left, for example, here. But that at least is the theory. In terms of compositional configuration, it is open, it is asymmetrical. In terms of space, the approach to space is the bird's eye view. That is, it is as if you were looking down at the object from a very high vantage point. Application of paint is very loose, that is, it is painterly, because, as Monet said, there are no lines in nature. There are 2 primary influences on the Impressionist painters. Photography, 19th century photography was a major influence, as was Japanese art, particularly Japanese woodblock prints, which are called ukiyo-e, which translates as pictures of a floating world. Let me show you a couple of other pieces by Monet. He did a number of series. This is his haystack series. And what he tried to do is show an object at different times of the day under different light conditions. And he said that he wanted to install them in a gallery in such a way that the viewer would walk in, be able to walk around the gallery and see the sequential movement of light over this object. Now, again, if you happen to be Monet, it doesn't matter what the object is. It can be a haystack, it can be a person, it can be a cathedral. Ultimately, it is only an object to reflect light. And they painted, the French expression is en plein air, that is outdoors, as you might recall. This is another painting done by Monet. And again, this is part of his Rouen Cathedral series. He did a number of series, as you might know. Let me show you briefly the work of Renoir, the other of the so-called orthodox or high Impressionist painters. This is called Nude in Sunlight. Excuse me, and he did it in the 1870s. Again, the decade of the Impressionist movement, as you know. So when a critic said of this piece, try to explain to Monsieur Renoir that the body of a woman is not a mass of decomposing flesh, he was referencing the use of blues and greens throughout. From Renoir's point of view, that was the color of shadows. And solar orange, as Monet described it, was the color of the sun. So that's the reason for the rather dappled effect of the skin of this Caucasian woman. You might recall, this is also Renoir, also Impressionism, that he reached something of an impasse during the 1880s. And he decided that he didn't know how to paint and he didn't know how to draw. So he does, in fact, return to classical art. There's a triangular compositional configuration here. It is basically closed with the exception of the figure on the far right who is looking out of the picture plane. Application of paint is a lot tighter, as you can see, as opposed to the loose quality of paint that you see here. Okay, let's go on to post-impressionism. There are two post-impressionist painters I ask that you keep in mind. First of all, Vincent van Gogh, whose work you see here. This is the self-portrait that we have at the DIA. And secondly, Toulouse-Lautrec as well. We talked at some length about the life, the very tragic life of Vincent van Gogh. And I hope you have had a chance to track down the film Loving Vincent, which is an excellent piece. I sent to you a clip about how it was made. I hope you did enjoy that. This is an early piece by Vincent van Gogh before he discovered Impressionism. It's called The Potato Eaters. And it references the very poor people among whom he worked when he was a minister in Belgium, working with abjectly poor coal miners. You might recall that part of his life. And then when he became disillusioned with formal religion, he turned to art, went to Paris, discovered the work of the Impressionists, lightened his palette, opened up his compositional configuration, used a bird's eye view approach to space. This particular painting was done after he left Paris and he went to the south of France to a town called Arles. This is called Night Cafe at Arles. You might recall this. And of it, he said, in quotes, "This is a place where men can lose their minds," quote unquote. The last major painting that Van Gogh did, entitled Crows Over Wheatfield, certainly it is portentous, and it seems to perhaps foretell his death, whether it was by suicide or by accidental shooting, we don't know. But the accidental shooting theory is a relatively new one, as you probably know. I also showed you the work of the post-impressionist painter Toulouse-Lautrec, one of whose paintings you see here. This is called At the Moulin Rouge. And Toulouse-Lautrec is pictured in the background. He is the figure of very short stature. You might recall he too was another tragic artist, figure of the fin de siècle, that means the end of the century in French, that is the 1890s. And the Moulin Rouge was very much of his muse. It was a club where he spent a lot of time, as you know. And Toulouse-Lautrec's salon in the Rue de Milan, this was a brothel where he in fact did spend a lot of time. So let's go on to the 20th century again and review Cubism and Expressionism as well. Now, I'll tell you right now, you should have some understanding about the concepts of Cubism and understand, please, analytical and synthetic Cubism. So you are looking at a fully developed analytical Cubist work done by Picasso. This is called Ma Jolie, which translates as My Beautiful One. You can see the title down at the bottom part of the picture plane. So let me review Cubism for you again in a cursory way, and I suggest that you go back to the original class for more material. But as I pointed out to you the first time around, this is, believe it or not, a form of naturalism. And what Picasso and his colleague Braque were trying to do was, as they stated, show the object as it really was rather than as it appeared to be. So this involves space as well as time, as if you were actually walking around the object and seeing it from various angles at the same time. Picasso called that simultaneity of viewpoint. Now, again, there are two basic styles of Cubism. First of all, analytical Cubism, which you see here. This is at the tail end of analytical Cubism. The years of that stage, 1907 to 1911. And it involved, on the one hand, as I just said, simultaneity of viewpoint, also the intrinsic integration between figure and ground, that is the object and the environment, as you can see here. Now, eventually, they got to the point where it was almost impossible to discern an actual object, so they believed that they had reached an impasse, and they therefore got involved in the second stage of Cubism, synthetic Cubism, 1911 to 1912. That adjective is derived from the noun, pardon me, analysis, and it involves essentially, I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm getting tired, the analytical adjective is derived from the noun analysis, which means breaking down the object into its essential geometrical components. Then when they reached the impasse and they decided that it was impossible to discern anything from the real world, they therefore embarked on the second stage of cubism, that is synthetic cubism. And that adjective is derived from the noun synthesis, as in putting together. So this took them into the realm of collage, the idea being that they would put together fragments that they had discovered during the analytical phase in a new way, vis-a-vis collage, in such a way that they would take on a reference to an object from the real world. That's the overview of Cubism. Let me ask that you take a look at the evolution. This is the first Cubist painting by Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, that is the young women of Avignon. So if you take a look at the influences here, there's African art, the work of Paul Cézanne, and also ancient Egyptian art, that is the figure on the far left. If you take a look at the figure at the lower right, you can see the beginning of simultaneity of a viewpoint. That is, you see the figure from the back, you see the head from the front, and in terms of the way that you view the head, you can see it frontally as well as in profile. Look at space, if you would. Space is no longer negative, it's no longer empty, but rather it has acquired form, and it's beginning to reflect the forms of the figures themselves. Okay, again, this is the first Cubist painting, 1907. From there, he goes to this stage, 1909. He's beginning to break open the object. Look, if you would, at the forehead of this figure. And he's allowing the surrounding space to begin to enter into the object. Taking analytical cubism a little farther, you can still make out forms of a natural object here if you superimpose a triangular configuration over it. But again, from that point, he got to this stage, Majoli, where it's almost impossible to reconstruct anything from the natural world. So he therefore goes to the second stage of cubism, synthetic cubism. As you can see here, this is collage. And he's quoting, as he says, from different realities, putting these geometrical forms together in such a way, vis-a-vis collage, that they take on a reference to an object from the natural world. That is, as you can see here, a guitar. Okay, let's take a look at the work of German Expressionism again. And this is the work of Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, which is entitled Self-Portrait, Artist and Model. And by the way, before I go any farther, the attendance number for today is 777. But as I pointed out to you the first time around, Expressionism is an art with a message. These people are trying to teach you something in many respects about what is wrong with society, in the case of people like Kirchner and Kater Kollwitz, for that matter as well. They believe that they have the right to distort reality in order to evoke a particular and often very intense emotion. So the subject matter and themes that they will be involved with are such things as questions of identity, the relationship between the sexes, anti-war themes for that matter as well. Clearly this has to do with the relationship between man and woman. And Kirchner's point of view here is that man should dominate woman. I showed you this piece the first time around, also by Kirchner, entitled Figures in the Street. And even though the female figures look much more powerful here than they do in this particular piece, I cautioned you not to think that Kirchner had changed his attitude toward women, essentially giving them some sense of power. But rather what you see here is the femme fatale, that is the dangerous woman who will prey upon any man who happens to come into her path. This is also Kirchner's work, which was in the Degenerate Art Exhibition. We talked about that the first time around. The Nazis branded the work of the expressionist degenerate. They rounded it up, they ridiculed it, they put it in an exhibition called the Degenerate Art Exhibition, which opened in 1937. And then they, in fact, auctioned a lot of it off a little bit later on. What Kirchner has done here is obviously portrayed himself as being physically wounded, having lost a hand. That actually never did happen to him. Certainly he experienced intense psychological and emotional wounds, as did the whole lost generation as a result of World War I. And Kater Kollwitz's work, let me show you her work as well. This is called variously The Laborer's Wife, or Woman with Shawl, Blue Shawl rather. She is another German expressionist artist. She was an independent, and given the attitudes toward women on the part of so many of the German expressionists, it shouldn't surprise any of us that she worked in an independent way. She had two major themes. On the one hand, the plight of the working poor, and secondly, the anti-war theme. This is a pretty important work of art that we talked about the first time around. It is called The Volunteers, and it was done in 1923. Kollwitz is essentially a printmaker. She was also a sculptor as well. But you have to understand this piece as against the events of the time period. When Germany lost the war, which ended in 1918, as you probably know, its economy was devastated because of worldwide events, because of the way that they had been treated by the victorious Allies. And so German cities were torn apart between those people who wanted to continue to support the quasi-democratic regime, as opposed to those people who believed that the only recourse for Germany to gain back its national pride was to go back to war. And obviously it was those people who eventually went out and supported Adolf Hitler. You should understand this image as against that political landscape. So she has talked about this. She says the figure on the far left represents death. It also represents the warmonger. Death, aka the warmonger, is embracing a dead man. The man in the center is dying. The person to the right of that has just been wounded. And the two people on the far right are naively, innocently, and ultimately tragically following the warmonger who's promising them glory, but in point of fact is going to take them to their deaths on the battlefield. Okay, folks, that is my last image. If you have any questions, as always, please do email me. You have the exam. I would like it, please, by May 5th. And as I said, please do email it to me and post it on Blackboard if you would. Again, I'm asking that you answer all 7 of the questions. Give me an answer for each question, which is approximately 1 page in length, typed and double-spaced. And do take care of yourself. Once more, if you have any questions, please do let me know.